could we be given warning at the beginning of a programme if there's going to be anything about the Beatles, as all Beatle fans can make sure to listen, and have a chance to ring up other fans to make sure they are also listening?
Hi everybody, this is John here. This is Paul, George,
and Ringo.
And we're very happy to be on your programme once again.
Welcome to Beatles News Briefs number 124. In this exclusive interview, Gary C. Bourgeois, one of the film industry's top re-recording mixers, speaks with me about his just completed, brand new Dolby Atmos mixing project for the Beatles film A Hard Day's Night. He talks about the project and reveals many technical details on what he did to create the mix, his past work with the Beatles and Beatles-related projects, and much, much more. Here we go. Hi, everybody. This is Steve Marinucci. I want to introduce Gary C. Bourgeois, who is known for his work remixing sound for movies. Have I covered everything? Because I looked down IMDb last night.
Right.
Is that all you do, or do you do more than that?
Well, no, it's called re-recording, which is the final mixing of a film.
Mm-hmm.
I started out in the business when I was like 19, and I was sent out as a production mixer for a couple of years, but then found my home really in re-recording. But I've also mixed music all my life. My vast majority of like 85% of what I do is for film. Mostly my specialty is dialogue and music, and I'm known for doing music for film. But I've also, over the years, done just straight music. I was Bob Dylan's engineer for a number of years. And over the years, I was involved with the Rolling Stones, mixing for them, and a lot of big artists. But directly relating to this subject of the Hard Day's Night, the person that owns the licensing and the titles wanted to do a Atmos version for special events that he's going to exhibit, and got in touch with the studio here in LA. The studio I have worked at numerous times over the years, and they knew my background. So that's why I got the phone call. But in fact, the head of the sound department at South Lake Audio in Burbank was my engineer for many years back, and knew that I had worked with George Harrison in the past. He knew that I worked with Paul McCartney in the past, with Jeff Emmerich, the Beatles engineer.
Can you go into a little more detail on what you did for each of those guys?
I'll just finish this thought. Steve, the head of the sound department, said, Gary, he said, I've been in touch with the person that owns the title and is requesting this, the client, as per se, and, mentioned your relationship. And he was like, oh, well, then he already knows the detail and the respect that is required for being able to do something like that. So that's why I was hired. You asked about my relationship with those guys. Having worked with and mixed with a lot of big artists, I mixed Michael Jackson even and others, that Paul McCartney and Jeff Emmerich were asked to write a couple of tunes for a film called Father's Day, produced and directed by Ivan Reitman.
Mm-hmm.
I've mixed 21 feature films for Ivan Reitman. So there's a very close relationship there, obviously. And he was very much into music and always had great artists supplying music for the films that we did. When this came up at the time, both Paul and Jeff Emmerich had never done any multi-channel projects. And Jeff was very interested in being with me to do these mixes. So on Stage S in Studio City, it was a big, beautiful feature film mixing room. I endeavored to take the tracks that Jeff supplied and make them into a 5.1 mix. Jeff was very respectful of my experience and my reputation, and obviously me of his. We just got along so well and had so much fun and really enjoyed it. But it was an education for him as to how you go about really interpreting, because most I hate to say it, but most music, and I'm a music mixer, I've mixed in a lot of studios, music studios, but most music engineers don't really understand the use of the storytelling ability to envelop the whole audio spectrum in a multi-channel format. And quite often we'll do things that will be what we would consider like a little strange. Oh, I'm going to put the snare drum in the surrounds. It's like, no, you can't do that shit, you know? But during the process with Jeff, like for instance, one of the first things he said is like, Gary, we don't put anything on Paul's voice. We don't put any reverb. We don't put anything on Paul's voice. It's dry. And I said, that's nice. Okay, that's good. Yeah. So I go about getting all the instruments sort of happening all around me, really cool. And I'll, snare drum up the middle, bass up the middle, stereo guitars, blah, blah. And with drape into the surrounds. So it feels like it envelops us. And then we were kept mixing and I was mixing Paul, and Paul just, to me, knowing what can be, felt very flat and up front and just dead, right? Whereas everything else was like happening all around us, And so I said, I want to experiment. I want to test something. I'm going to put a little bit of not verb as per se, a little combination of a short room and a little short verb in the surrounds so that it lifts his voice off the screen. And, oh, no, I don't know. I'm not sure, says he. We went around in circles for about 4 hours of, and I got it to the point where I felt really comfortable that it was barely noticeable, but it was servicing the purpose that I was looking for, where it's taking it off the screen, off that flat plane. And he's like, yeah, maybe. And so like he was slowly starting to acquiesce a little bit. And then at one point, I thought, without him knowing, I'm just going to kill the surrounds. And so it's the thing's playing and whatnot. And I turned sideways and I just went click like that. And he went, oh my God, what happened? That's awful. And so I said, I switched off what we're doing in the surrounds. He says, put it back I put it back. He goes, that's so cool. That's so much better. You barely even know that anything has been added at all. I said, well, that's that fine line that we walk always in all our mixing, even in 2-track stereo in the mixed room. You put, the 80s, there's long reverbs, and then the 90s came along, there was no reverb, and then slowly we got back to a bit of reverb. And, there's cycles in the whole business, whether it be film or music. Fortunately for me, film has embraced multi-channel from a very early, I was mixing 5.1 back in, I think, 1982 or something like that. And so what happens is you slowly educate yourself when you're going through the process as to what is right, what is not cool, not wrong. There's rules, there's general rules for any type of mixing, always to be broken. It's like the English language. But what you do start to realize is how much it enables the sound to tell the story better, to envelop the audience, not just with the music, but in my case, like, all the sound effects and the backgrounds and the happening all around. Even when you start a new scene, you have the sound of the backgrounds a little higher just for a few moments to set the space. You're sitting in the soup, as I say, And then as soon as somebody starts talking, you pull that back a bit. So you're telling the audience to focus in on what's happening, right? Well, strangely enough, a lot of times in the music industry and in how we mix music in stereo, for instance, and of course it was mono for many years, and then it became stereo. And back then, a lot of mixers, that stereo stuff is like, stick with the mono. We don't need that stereo stuff. And of course, now we're getting lots of responses where, why are we doing this in Dolby Atmos? It was meant for stereo. I said, well, actually, it was originally mono. So, would you rather have me mix it on a Victrola? I mean, how far back do you want to live? And I've
Hmm.
always said people that don't embrace what you can do are just hugging the tree too hard. It's like, yeah, I mix stereo for music, but I know in my head, it's like, oh, I could do so much more and it would be so much better. And it doesn't have to be distracting, but I can just make it more emotional and certain phrases I can let blossom. And there's a storytelling even in a music cue,
Hmm.
and people for most of the time just whatever the musicians did, don't mess with that. That's everything. It's like, well, to tell you the truth, when people cut out and the bass player is doing this thing, even a phrase in the middle of a song, not even a solo, just a phrase, it's like
Hmm.
you address that phrase so that it cuts and it says something, and it's like, whoa, that's so cool because it was a melodic piece by the bass player, and I made it cut, maybe raise it a dB or two, and it's like, oh, and then it goes back, and you do it in a way that people aren't aware. It's just happening, and it's like so much better. Well, it's the same thing with 5.1, 7.1, Dolby Atmos. It's like you have more to play with. And
Hmm.
you have, as much as, in analog, you have certain outboard equipment that's not automated, et cetera. Oh, it's the best stuff. It's like, yeah, I had all that stuff for years. I had the $13,000 TCM 6000, when it first came out. It's like I just sold my last one a couple of months ago. But, all the plugins that you have now, they're all just tools. And how you use them is really important. And a lot of people I've noticed, and this is my opinion, just don't use the tools well. It's like getting the best hammer, whatever that is, and holding your hand too close to the head of the hammer. And, it's like it'll take you all day to nail that nail, you know.
Hmm.
But if you hold your hand down at the back and just crack your wrist, wham, two hits, the nail's in.
Let me ask one thing, first of all, before we get too far away from this. Do you remember the names of the tracks on Father's Day?
A young boy, that
Okay.
was one of them, and The World Tonight.
Ah, okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
I
Now, how about,
actually,
go
I
ahead.
knew that you were going to ask that question because I put it on my other computer on the screen. I said, here it comes. Oh, by
Thank
the
you.
way, also George Harrison, when I worked with him, I was working with him on Five Corners, which was a really outstanding project. And
Hmm.
the percussionist for Elton John and whatnot, Stu. I can't remember his name, but he was sort of like the music producer. But
Hmm.
anyway, we had a ball working together. And also George was in every day. It's a month that you get to know somebody, where do you want to go to lunch? So it was a joy working with them. And I'll tell you a kind of a funny story. At the end of the film, he put in a Beatles tune for the tail credit music, right?
Hmm.
But we put it in, and it was short for the length of the titles, the credits, short by like maybe a phrase, right? It's like, oh, well, we're short. I said, you want me to edit this so that we make it work the right length? He's like, what? He says, you don't edit Beatles music. You can't do that. And I'm like, okay, all right. I said, shall we pick another tune or something? Or maybe we could change the speed of the credit roll. I mean, there's a lot of tools that we have available to us, right?
Right.
So we ended up doing a bit of both, change the tune and also a bit of the speed control. And then when we were all finished, we were happy. Gary says, could you show me what you would have done? And I said, sure. I said, leave the room for a minute so you don't see what I'm doing because I want you to be presented anew. And he goes, okay. And I said, it'll take me 6 minutes. I said, okay. And I go in and I take one phrase and do a repeat, but not a direct repeat, like a repeat down the line, and do cross mixing and all that, all the good stuff, right? And then I said, come on in. He comes and he listens. He goes, oh my God, that's really good. Well, we can't do it, And I cracked up laughing. I said, no, you're being true, just as much as I'm being true to a lot of things that we do, with
Right.
Beatles and whatnot. But he said, and do you do that like in other films? And it's like, Absolutely, all the time. He was like shocked. I said, but if you do it poorly, it stands out like bad ADR, bad voice replay. It's like everybody says, "Oh, I can always tell it when it's ADR." It's like, no, you can't, because you can only tell when it's badly done. If it's really excellently done, you have no idea. I found over the years there's always cliches about almost everything that we do, and the cliches quite often just pertain to, yeah, well, when it's done badly, it's shit, you know. So anyway, I loved working with George. He was a sweetheart. And as a matter of fact, I don't know how much time we have, but
You have as much time as you want.
well, I remember that one of the producers came, a younger guy, one of the producers on that film, Five Corners, came in one morning and he had a whole stack of albums and memorabilia and stuff like that. And I sort of turned around and I said, "What is that for?" He says, "Oh," he says, "I want George to sign the stuff." And I said, "I see." I said, "That would be really sweet." I said, "Now, either you take that stuff out, back out to your car, lock it up, and never say another word. Do you understand what an honor it is to be working with this guy? And that when an artist comes into a studio, they are at their new home. If they don't feel like they can walk around in their robe and slippers, they're uncomfortable. You come in and ask like a fan. Now, all of a sudden, this isn't his private space. This is not his home." I said, if Variety or Hollywood Reporter could clue into all the various mixers that work with all these great artists all the time, they'd get all the scoop on everything, all that, because everything is talked about in these rooms, but they're private rooms. Like it's like what happens in Vegas, or what happens in the studio, and what's said in the studio stays in the studio. You have to have a safe environment. Even when you go out to the lobby and get coffee or whatever, everybody knows like the respect level. You don't bring stuff up. It's like they've got to feel at home. So I
Right.
said, "Oh, okay." And then he went out and put the stuff in his car and came back in. Now I could tell he was like devastated that he wasn't going to get, you know.
Hmm.
And but at the end of it all, I said, "George," I said, "we've all been here together and whatnot." I said, "I don't even want a picture." I said, "I never ask for pictures or whatever. I never step over a line." And I said, "But," I said, "our producer here, and I'm speaking for him, would love to have you sign something." "Oh, yeah, I would do that." And then he got it and he was so happy. And I said, "That's how you do it."
That's a great story. So that up until now, that's been your experience working on Beatle projects, correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. How did
I've worked with huge artists. Mariah Carey, I've done stuff with her, and Wu-Tang Clan. But my credit with them mostly is just like film credits, even though I'm spending all the time mixing music with them.
hmm
And even the music producers realize when they walk in thinking, what do we know in film? It's like they realize, oh my God, the standards and the expectations are much higher than they ever would have known. And
Right.
realize afterwards to step back and just let the magic happen.
How did this project come about with A Hard Day's Night?
As I said earlier, the person that owns the licensing, I'm not going to say his name because I don't have that permission, but it's somebody who's known the Beatles for decades and decades, like sort of grew up with them. So, you know, anyway, whenever he has picture changes, you know, whatever they might be, or audio changes to any of the titles, he uses the studio that I did this. He uses that facility, and they have a specific archival department, which is huge. They do a lot of big titles. And so they've had a relationship with him for years. And when he said he wanted to do this, he said, you know, this is what I want, but it has to be done with great deference, you know. And so the head of the sound department got in touch with me, knowing my background.
Okay. And your job was to remix it in Dolby Atmos.
That's
Did I pronounce that right?
yeah,
Atmos.
Atmos, yeah.
What does that do to the music?
Sorry.
Seriously,
Well,
for people that
okay,
just know the words but don't know
yeah, the
what
implication.
exactly it does.
Yeah, yeah. No, I get it. I get it completely. Matter of fact, I had a couple of comments from music engineers saying like, what the hell are you doing? So I'll explain a little bit. This is a deep explanation.
Go ahead.
Hopefully it covers enough information that you don't get swamped with more, questions and comments.
There are people that will see this that won't be swamped, believe me. So I don't mind how deep we're going. I really
Oh,
don't.
that's great. That's great.
Just do it.
Well, on a very basic level, the original was 16 millimeter black and white mono. Everything mono. Okay. And actually, whoever the production mixer on the production did a very good job. The sound was good. And of course, the original music recordings were in mono and sounded really great, Right away, when you hear that, and considering how old 1964, end of 63, 64, is like, holy cow, sounds really great. I wish Jeff was still alive. I could ring him up. But so then a number of years later, Giles Martin did a mix, a 5.1 mix for Apple, and the Apple mix engineers, in collaboration with Giles, did a 5.1 mix because the Beatles are considered music. That's how people look at them. And so instead of having a film person that knows and understands the format, it was music people. And don't forget, I'll keep repeating, I'm in the music business and the film business. So it's just like an awareness of a different point of view and a different attack and a different attitude, right? So not knowing how it normally is mixed for 5.1, Jill did an outstanding job, but there were issues in my mind, that's for sure, and a number of us, where they put the left and the center and the right equal voice for all the talking, the dialogue, and the music. Left, center, right, equal. Okay. First of all, that's a big no-no for us. It's like, no, you put the voice and the vocals center with, if you want, a very slight drape, just to open it up a bit. Very, very slight, like down minus, 12 to 18, somewhere in there, it's like a lot. Here's what's not understood is that if you're in the music business, sound business, you sit in the middle of your console with the center speaker and right in between the stereo speakers, right, left and right. And you're sitting in what's called the sweet spot. Okay. Most film mixers sit slightly left or slightly right of the center, right? First of all, we have to take into consideration that when you have an audience in the theater, that less than 12% of the audience is sitting in the sweet spot. A third is sitting on the left and a third is sitting on the right. When you have the vocals or the dialogue equal in the left, center, right, when you're sitting on the left, you're looking at Paul singing. He's in the center of the screen, but you're hearing his voice come out of the left because you're sitting on the left-hand side. What you're hearing and what you're seeing, you're not relating to. It's the same if you're on the right, you're not related. You need an anchor. The anchor is the center. So I immediately took that and pulled the vocals and the dialogue down a good between 12 and 18 dB. And I increased the center a bit so that we are now anchored with the center, okay? Also, what they did was that they nicely put the music all in the surrounds, and so it worked around us. But I had to take the vocals out of the surround. Here's why, because what they didn't take into account is that if you put the vocals in the surround, if you're in a large theater and you're sitting near the back, you are now hearing the vocals before in the surround before you're hearing the vocals coming out the front. How can you possibly know how much delay to put into that vocal because every theater is a different size. So you just don't do that. That's one of those rules of thumb. So what I did do though was I draped a little bit of the vocals into the surrounds just so that it lifted it off the screen like I was telling you about with Paul McCartney. But I would even test by like sitting there playing, you're mixing, you just hit stop, like boom, right away. And you can hear exactly how much, because it's not laid down, it's not recorded, it's still, in the session. So when you hit stop, the reverb, you still hear it, the faders are up. And it's like, oh, it's barely there. It's just enough to lift it off the screen, but I'm not affecting the interpretation of what we're supposed to hear. And so I did that instead of putting the vocal directly in the surrounds because you don't know how much delay for the room. That's the problem. So that's one of the things I did. It turned out great. Also, there was almost no use of the sub. And I did not want to really introduce something that was never there, but I do have it available to me. So when I was doing the Dolby Atmos mix, Paul McCartney, I'm going to step back for a second. First of all, the mono and split it into spectral layers. And we use spectral layering AI to do that. And in fact, it was a good thing that the mono was so good because when you take stereo and you split it into spectral layers, you can have, not always, but you can have phase issues. If the original source is mono, you don't have those issues at all.
Right.
So it's like, it was better. And I'm like, thank God, But also, the spectral breakdown or stem breakout is still addressed by AI and it's interpretive. And so we went through a process of to make sure that we were using the best plugin for the interpretation of the music. And we went with spectral layers. Paul's bass playing on the track, on the guitar track, when we broke it down into vocals, guitars, drums, and bass. And the guitars track had a fair amount of Paul's bass still there. And the bass track was a little bumpy. I don't know what else, this sort of thing, right? And I did not want to get into equalizing and messing with the sound that I've ended up with getting, being very respectful of the fact that everybody in the world knows what these songs sounds like, and also respectful of all their work. And because I was good friends with Jeff, it's like, I know what care we took, but that that I ended up with, I thought that's peaking at, a particular frequency. It was, I can't remember what it was now, 300 or something, but it was just peaking at a certain frequency. And I thought, it sounds like that too. And so what I did was, this might sound blasphemous, but I was dealing with what I've got to work with. And I also rely on my ears more than I do what I see. You learn this in the film business, you end up EQing production dialogue and whatnot. And if you actually turned over and looked at what you were doing, it'd be like, my God, it's like it's all over the place. Oh my God. Yeah. So all my life, it's just like, what does it sound like? What do I ended up with? What is good, So I'm listening and I thought, okay, so I'm going to EQ down only a couple of dB on that peak that I was hearing. I put a little bit of compression so it didn't pop out, but very small amount. I use Fab Filter multi-band compression, and I just pick that frequency. I don't touch anything else, just pick that frequency. And then what I did was I added a very small amount of sub because I wanted to fill it out, give it some richness. but not change the sound. But because I
Okay.
changed that one little hump, I thought I want to make up for that in a pleasant, rich way. So that's what I did. Now we're talking small amounts. It was not a disrespectful, oh, I can make this sound better. It's like, are you kidding? Put that away. That attitude is not going to be in this room. But doing the very best that you can, given with what you're working with. And a lot of people will say, oh, I wouldn't have done that. But it's like, okay, you're not there. I'm here. That's number one. Number two, the original was mono, and I'm trying to make it into Atmos version around us. It's like there has to be something that makes it Atmos and worthwhile for the client to release it in Atmos.
Hmm.
If it sounded exactly the same as it used to, like everybody be like, well, where is it? Why? Also, beyond the music, and of course, most people will be more concerned with the music than anything else, but the original production sound, there was almost no sound effects added. It was just the production. This was 1964. And believe it or not, I'm so old that I knew the sound editor, Gordon Daniels, that was on the project. And I knew him quite well. And it's like, they didn't add anything. It was just the production. Well, basically, the original production was really good, but Gordon Daniels, the supervising sound editor, did not add, they just edited the production, but they didn't add anything, no sound effects or anything like that. When you watch the film, there's sound effects missing all over the place. It wouldn't just simply wouldn't be done that way nowadays.
Okay.
But what I wanted to do was not change and add things that weren't there before, because then people would be like, hey, that was never there before. When you're mixing something like this, you're talking about an audience that is so well educated and so knowledgeable that you have to be super respectful, because otherwise you'll take them out. You'll take them out of the process, right?
I ask one question
Yeah.
before, just because I know everybody's kind of wondering, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about a theatrical presentation? Are we talking about DVDs? What are we?
DVDs, of course, DVDs just aren't used anymore, but it would be more streaming or something like that. My understanding, I did a theatrical Atmos version, asked of me and required, and a home version. So that sort of indicates to me that there's an intent, very possibly, to release the home Atmos version on some platform. Now, the platforms over the years vary a great deal, as just simply the fact that it came out mono and then there was a stereo version and now there's an Atmos version. Somebody yelled at me saying, the original target for the Beatles was mono and then it was stereo. Now, what are you doing now? And I said, the target has changed. It's as simple as that. It's like, yeah, there's a new target. And I'm trying to do my very best to be respectful of the previous targets.
So when you say you're taking it from mono,
Mhm.
is there separation
Yes.
there is separation?
Well, the separation came from using spectral layers as a
Okay.
plugin. That breaks it down into, guitars, vocals, bass, drums, right? So now all of a sudden I've got a little bit more to work with than a mono, obviously, right?
Hmm.
That's music. I'm going to pick up where I left off about the sound that was on the original film, where sound effects were not added and they're just not there quite often. And I thought, okay, I'm not going to add any of those, but there are certain ambient things that I could possibly use, that I could put sort of like back a little bit and in the ceiling and a little bit of drape into the sides. So it creates a bit of a rainbow, just sort of like at the back of your head. So it fills out and fills the room. And what I decided, I made a bunch of notes and then I had my editor, I said, I don't want new material added. I want to just use the original material. I said, you've got to sample, for instance, a section of the train. You have to make it into stereo and supply it to me so I can put it into the objects tracks and the sidewalls, just sort of the back, so that when the first 12 minutes is this train. So I added the train on the tracks, just sort of back here, so lightly that it's not only did it give a consistency that wasn't there for all the talking and everything else on the train. Every shot it would change justifiably, but it was never, no sound effects of the train were ever added. So I put this, as I say, it's sort of like a rainbow in the back, just so that once again it lifts us back off the center and has a use for the Atmos. In other words, why did we do this with the Atmos if it's just stuck up in the middle of the center, for all the dialogue and all the production? So I just sort of opened it out a little bit by adding the train sound. Then when the train stops and they run outside and they're running through the car, open and close the doors and going through the cars, and they're screaming girls. So I had a track made of those screaming girls on that track. And then I added them so that we were more excited and enveloped by the experience. Once again, just taking it off the flatness of the left, center, right, and making it just come into the room a little bit. So it's like, it's fun. There were certain scenes where the girls are running down the road and they're chasing the car and all that sort of stuff. And I just had some exterior ambience that I added so that you didn't just feel like you were just in the original flat. You were a little bit more enveloped, so that there was at least a reasoning for having the Dolby Atmos working. Now, once again, I'll just reiterate, so slight that if you were in the theater, you would feel it, but you wouldn't feel like anything's changed. You know what I'm saying? And that was my intent.
Okay.
To be as respectful as possible.
Yeah. You mentioned online that Giles was not involved. Do you see things differently than he does, or do you know why that didn't?
I don't know, Giles. I knew his father.
Ah,
So that goes without saying. And what a gentleman, what a sweetheart. He was not involved. He was not asked to be involved, as far as I know, but not out of disrespect in any way, because he's great. He's a great producer. I just think that the client, found out my background and said, just go for it, which I did. And my understanding from the head of the archival department, who knows him and worked, enormously happy, and he sort of left it up to me. But the people that my team, the chief engineer and who's, I knew for years, my mix tech, my sound editor, we're all like, really, they felt like we really nailed it, where we did what is asked for, but in a way that will be hopefully really acceptable to everybody that knows the material really well.
you're talking in a way like we're not talking about Apple here, and they don't have the copyright or the movie rights to A Hard Day's Night. It's somebody else. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And they are the ones that are doing this project, not the Beatles directly, correct?
Correct. That's correct.
Okay. Okay.
The guy was respectful enough, knowing that his title, to not just have anybody do it. I'm trying to be as modest as possible, but I have a massive amounts of experience in this. I started in 1969.
Okay.
And I mixed Janis Joplin before she died.
I saw the fact that you did the first Janis movie, and
Yeah.
I went through all the movie credits. I did not go through the music credits.
Uh-huh.
Can you just go through a few of them? Janis Joplin is one that we.
Well, obviously, I was with Bob Dylan for years. I lived at his house in Point Dume, and my introduction to living in California was at Bob Dylan's house in Point Dume. And I did a lot of work with Bob for many years. So that's kind of a decent credit. When the Rolling Stones were doing the Steel Wheels tour, and they shot a film in IMAX, it was called The Biggest Damn Movie You Ever Saw. And they went through, I think it was like 8 music mixers, including their main guy who, does all their stuff. And they just were completely not happy. with how it sounded. And then the producer up in Canada knew that I had tons of experience with IMAX. Matter of fact, I did some of the very first IMAX up in Toronto. And so they said, could you take a stab at this? And I said, sure, okay. There's another guy that is doing the music pre-dubbing and putting it into stems and whatnot. And I said, I'll take the stems and let's see what we can do. And so I got to mix the first song, which is Start Me Up, and did it how I knew best to work with IMAX. And we sent a mag, a 35 millimeter mag, to Mick Jagger in New York and then Keith in France, and they weren't talking to each other. This was a time when they hated each other's guts. I knew this. I was told this. That's why I had to send it to two different places, right? They had gone through so many different mixers and rejecting every time. So before I sent off the mag to each of them, I wrote on a piece of foolscap with a felt marker. I said, Dear Mick, I have no idea what Keith thinks of this, but I'd love to have your feedback and your attention. Love, Gary. Dear Keith, I have no idea what Mick thinks of this, but sent them out. And both of them played it and they said, well, thank God, finally, somebody who knows this format and it sounds fabulous. Keep going. That was the response. And the producer was like, oh, thank God, because they were spending lots of money on all these mixes and stuff. And so ended up mixing the whole thing. And they were like, happy as could be. And later on met them when they were both talking to each other. As a matter of fact, Keith plays in a band with Waddy Wachtel, and I'm friends and know Waddy Wachtel quite well. Matter of fact, Waddy did music for a number of Adam Sandler films, and I've done 16 Adam Sandler films. So I worked with him in the past. And so Waddy would say, hey, come down to the joint. I'm playing tonight with the boys. I would come down, met with Keith and mentioned that I had done that. And he says, oh, thank God, you did a great job. So that's sort of the relationship you get in this business when you're working with the top people in the world. There's just connections that if you know that person and that person likes you, then you're immediately okay.
Okay.
And the nice thing is that the bigger the artist, generally speaking, not always, the nicer they are, the more gracious they are. And quite often there's a number of people that I will say, I'm so honored that you're here and that, I'm getting to meet with you and all that sort of stuff. And oftentimes they say, you don't understand, Gary. There's 1,000 great artists. There's like 18 great mixers. We're honored to be here when we're really happy that you're doing this, And right away you get a level playing field. It's not a subservient role. It's not, somebody who's lording it over because they're the great artist. Michael Jackson was just an absolute sweetheart. And at the end of the session, he said, do you want me to sign anything? You've got a son and a daughter. And I said, yeah, that'd be great. And so I pulled out once again a piece of, yellow foolscap and a felt marker. And he says, is there anything particular that you want me to say? And I didn't know this, but he doesn't usually ask that question. He just signs Michael Jackson. Yeah. And I said, yes. I said, listen to your dad love Michael Jackson. And he cracked up and I said, well, I'm a single father. I need all the power I can get. He thought that was hilarious. It's things like that you look back and you realize I've worked with a lot of the greatest artists, and 95% of them are just the sweetest, nicest professional people. They're just great.
What did you work on for Michael Jackson?
Michael Jackson had a concert coming up. This was way back. I can't remember the girl's name, but a female guitar player who was a ripper.
She was the one that was in the movie on the last tour that didn't happen.
Yeah.
I can't remember her name, but yeah, she was tremendous.
They had pre-recorded a bunch of stuff and he wanted me to mix that stuff, which I did. He also did some film bits or clips and also a commercial for Cheerios or something like that, or Snap, Crackle, and Pop or something like that, where he was dancing and singing in a cereal bowl. It was hilarious. It was like, are you kidding? He wanted me to mix that, so I did that. I'll tell you a quick little Michael Jackson thing. It's like I had never seen him live, and we started working and whatnot. And he always speaks very softly and quietly. And there was nobody in the room but us. And he would have a chef come at lunch hour and make food and all that. But otherwise, it was just us. And it was a joy working with him. He was a sweetheart. And at a certain point, he says, Gary, he says, do you mind if there's two phrases there that I think I could sing better. Do you mind if I just go like in the booth over there and re-sing them? I said, Jesus, yeah, that's why there's a microphone, go for it. He says, I have to warn you, I stomp my foot when I'm singing. But I said, oh, yeah. I says, no, it's not tapping. It's like a drill into the floor. He said, it's stomp. And I said, okay, well, I said, I'm, the usual miking, 8 inches from slightly off angle. That's how I like the mic. I said, and I'm going to do another one just like a little lower and miking up a bit in case it'll be just as good, but in case the footstep thing is too much, this will have a little less, of that stomping. Oh, whatever you need. Okay, fine. He goes in the booth and I open the microphones and the music's playing. It's playing in his ears. And all of a sudden, this foot starts going. It's like loud as shit. I'm like, oh my fucking God. And I'm pulling back, and then he starts singing. And I've been listening to him for a couple of weeks at this point, just quietly talking quietly. And then this voice comes, and I looked around the room. I thought, this is like an opera singer. He fills the room with his voice.
Mm.
I didn't realize, I thought, oh, I get it. One of the most talented vocalists I've ever heard. Holy shit, this is really something, And he stomp, 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 he sings. And then he goes to the microphone. How's that? In this quiet whisper again, how was that? And I said, yeah, I think it was good. Why don't you come out and take a listen? And I said, you surprised me a little bit. He says, that's why I sort of warned you. I said, well, I think you did. And it was just, to me, it was an eye opener. I'm like, my God, this guy has got
Mm.
pipes. He's real. And he's a slight person. But there's other artists they're very slight and they have this voice that just, blossoms. And it's like, where the hell did that come from? So anyway, it's interesting because I quite often do, what do you call it, where you're talking to a large group, and
A lecture.
when you're giving a talk, master classes, I do them all over the world. And my favorite for a long time, I used to mix in Russia quite a bit. I would be brought over for projects there. And up until the war, it was a delight to be there, both Moscow and St. Petersburg, great cities. And I would do master classes. And my general philosophy was that if it was a 3-hour masterclass, I would have 4 stories because I don't like living in the past. I don't like talking about the old days or how we used to do it. There's a wall that goes up when you have a whole class and you start talking about mag, and they're like, what the fuck is that? Basically, you talk about the now, you talk about the future, where things are going, you talk about your philosophical platform or attitude or approach to things that are current for the audience. But I would always do like 4 stories and they would all laugh and be entertained. But at the end of the master class, those 4 stories would add up and I would conclude with a theme that was an overall universal theme based on those 4 stories. So it connects them and they will never forget the whole lecture for 3 hours. They will never forget a word because they can tie it to something, But once again, the reason why I was mentioning this was that generally speaking, if you just talk about the old days or whatever like that, there's this wall that goes up of like disinterest. You can't do that. You just can't do that. So me telling you some of these stories, it's like, it's a rare event for me, and I would prefer not to because all of us have stories that we sort of keep to ourselves. There's only a small handful that have their pictures taken with all the various artists and stuff like that. It's like, no, I'm honored just to be doing this, just to be in the room with certain people and starting to understand the characteristics that make them who they are. you know. I mean, when I was working with Mariah Carey, and we just finished a long piece, and she sort of looks at me, and she had learned to really trust me. As a matter of fact, we became pretty good friends. I worked with Nick Cannon after that because of that. Anyway, and she said, does this sound a little maudlin? She said, I can get really sappy from time to time. And I just turned and looked at her. I said, you think? She goes, what do you mean? She surrounds her whole life with people that are yes people. And I wouldn't let her get away with stuff. I would just, I live my life on my sleeve. I'm just very open and transparent. And if something's a train wreck, I said, oh my God, that's a train wreck. And it's like, what do you mean? So, oh, we got to fix this, somehow. But she was like, what are you talking about? And I said, well, yeah, you're a little maudlin sometimes. And I said, there's a whole 20, 30 seconds that we could cut back. Maybe we don't have to go that far, but yeah, you're pumping it a little much. Show me, show her. And at the time, her producers were Jimmy Jam, Terry Lewis, and Jackson. What's his name? Jackson, the bass player, famous bass player, Randy Jackson. And they're like, he's getting away with murder. How is this possible? And I would change it, and she'd be happy. And they said, we're leaving, and they just left it up to her and I, and we ended up with a really good relationship, and it was fun. And actually, she's not the reason why I ended up working with Nick Cannon. I ended up working with Nick, and then like and I knew they were married at the time. And the second or third day, I said, Nick, Mariah might not remember who I am at all. I said, but just tell her if tonight, say, Gary says hi. And I said, she might not remember me. I said, but I just thought I'd throw it. She says, oh, okay, no problem. And he comes back the next morning. Oh my God, you're God. It's the world of you. And I said, oh, that's really sweet. I had a really good time with her. And he said, yeah, she was smart enough to realize that you're an honest person and you say exactly what you think. And I always thought, they're all of them are just humans. They're frail. I don't care how big you are, they're frail. And if they can know that they're in good hands and that they can trust you, that's everything.
Let me ask a couple of questions before I forget. Did either Paul or Ringo work with you on the Hard Day's Night thing?
No,
No.
no.
So
I understand. I'm pretty sure that they knew, because the person that's owns the licensing has got a good relationship with them. So I'm sure that they were told. I don't know if he would even be allowed to do it without their consent. Finished. I only finished a week ago.
I was going to ask you how long it took you.
Well, it didn't take long because there's not a lot. There was more pre-production time doing the splits, very carefully and all that sort of stuff. The mix time was like a couple of weeks, but the total time was like 3.5 weeks or something like that. I mean, when you don't have a lot to work with, there's not a lot that you should do.
You told me before we started taping about the social media reaction to your announcing this. Tell me that again, because that was interesting to hear what you said when you posted the pictures of yourself with the scene from the movie behind you.
Yeah. Well, it's rare that I post anything, but I was so honored, and I thought, oh, my friends will think that this is, fun. I don't think anybody's surprised that I did it because I do this shit. And by the way, redoing something like this, doing for archival or whatever, is not what I do as per se. But I can do it because of what I do. But I was just hoping that a few friends would just be like, hey, that sounds like fun. The reaction was overwhelming. And everybody's concern was about the music, but not about the film sound at all, and being respectful of the music. And all I can say is I'm sure all of them that I was as respectful as I could possibly be. The reaction, generally speaking, was good. There were a number of people like, why would you do this?
Yeah, I saw a couple of those reactions, and I liked your comment on one of them was, well, maybe the rights holder asked me to.
Yeah.
Which is, I mean, that's as good an answer as you can give.
Ultimately, when you think about it, it's like if the client wants this done, somebody's going to do it. I'm just glad that it was somebody that understood the overall in a way that it would be done with a great deal of respect. And
Okay.
so, there were guys that, like, why you? And I'm like, when I was drumming, I was a professional drummer for many years. And, you're playing some jazz fusion, whatever. The audience is all there. And I remember being in the audience when I was like 14, 15 years old. And I'm like, this guy's not that great. And I'm sitting in the audience. And I started to realize there's a lot of great guys in the audience, but that guy's got the gig. Whether he's better, worse, doesn't matter. That guy's getting paid. He's got the gig because somebody in the band really likes him. And for whatever, there's a plethora of reasons.
Right.
Ultimately, it's like I've got great friends and cohorts that are just the greatest mixers in the world, Andy Nelson and Mike Minkler and all the big names, and we're all friends and whatnot. And Mike Minkler, who's one of the greatest of all time, called me out, damn, Gary, you got that gig. God bless you. And I knew he was thinking, oh, why didn't I get it? But we both know it's like, yeah, but I got it. And when you get something like that, I'm like, good for him. I'm really glad. Yeah, I wish I had it. But ultimately, you have to acquiesce and say, oh, no, somebody who's just as good as you or great got the gig. And you have to let it go. Yeah.
Right. Do you know when we're going to see the fruits of your labors?
No, I asked about that and I don't know. That's a client distribution question that I don't know.
Did,
Even where or how, I don't know.
did they tell you that they would use your work? I mean, is your work going to be used? I don't mean that in a negative way, but I mean, did they say, were they happy with what you did?
Yes.
Okay.
Put it this way, whatever purpose they had in mind, this is going to serve that purpose. They're very happy. It turned out really well. And whether it goes to home Atmos or if it goes to special events, whatever that means in his vernacular.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out because you use that word online too. And I'm trying to think of special events, like what?
Yeah,
You
what
know?
is well, hello. Don't you think I was asking that? Like,
Yeah.
what am I supposed to be preparing this for? And now I just realized I said, well, unlike sorry to say, but unlike the music business, the film business has really stringent set of standards, reference points, like monitor levels and imaging set. It's all set up. And if you work within the framework of the references that you know are true, then you're mixing so that it can play in any Dolby Atmos venue and turn out the way it was meant to be played.
So you're, so
Atmos itself, technically Atmos, conforms the imaging to the speaker setup. You could have 50 speakers in the ceiling, you could have 10 speakers in the ceiling. It's going to take the mix and conform the imaging so that it is the same for whatever the Dolby Atmos setup is.
it sounds like we're looking at a theatrical thing. It's going to
I,
be exhibited in theaters. Yeah,
I think.
you
But
think?
I don't think it's going to be a wide release. I don't think this is the new Beatles mix. I don't see it as a wide release. I might be surprised, and it is, but I don't think so. When the word special events, I think to myself like the Sphere in Vegas or, special events, whatever that means, as opposed to a wide release.
But I'm thinking like Fathom events where they do, special screenings of classic movies and stuff, and special events. That's what I'm thinking. So,
Well,
but who knows?
you're just adding to my ignorance on it in a good way, in a positive way, because it's like, yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all I can say.
Okay. Well, I just want to say thank you for taking the time and going through all this and all the discussion about the business and everything. That was just really wonderful. And
Thank you. I appreciate it.
thank you again.
Be seeing you.